to the Just Transition report, which he has, so to speak, been promoting since its publication a year ago. So thank you, Fadhel. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see it, and you're able to hear me. Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually no longer based in Ethiopia with that organization. I'm based in Nairobi with PowerShift Africa, but I'm currently in Cape Town. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to speak with all of you today. I wanted to call this presentation the economic imperative of a just transition, and I'll be laying out the basic points that we've made in the Just Transition report in a minute. But I wanted to emphasize the following line, which is that we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And I'll explain what I mean by that over the next few minutes. So with that, starting with the Just Transition report, a climate, energy, and development vision for Africa, which is available on our website, both in English and in French, justtransitionafrica.org. This is a report that was published a year ago by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which is a group that was convened by Dr. Yuba Sukona of Mali, who at the time was the vice chair of the IPCC. And what we try to do in this report, and I'll try to explain this today, is essentially put forward a long-term, coherent, comprehensive vision written from an African perspective for African policymakers that would simultaneously address issues that are typically siloed. So we wanted to simultaneously address climate policies, energy policies, and development policies. And when I say development, it also includes debt issues, external debt issues, which I'll mention today. So this is really what we tried to do. And when the report was released about a year ago, it was very well received, not only on the African continent, but really across the global South. Because as you'll see today, some of the structural issues that we address in this report, that we highlight, are prevalent across the global South. So that is the starting point of this report, and it really started with this idea that it's very important to put forward an African long-term strategic vision. And when I say long-term, we're talking about 50 to 100-year strategic transformative vision that will undo some of the structural traps that we've been dealing with in Africa and across the global South. And the thing is that every major economic bloc in the world, whether it's the US or China or Europe, every economic bloc has long-term strategic visions for themselves. And they have every right to have that. And they have every right. I'm sorry. And they have every right to use economic incentives and economic diplomacy to nudge every country to where they want to see them on that map. And what we wanted to say in this report is that so do we. Africa also has every right to put forward its own long-term strategic vision for transformation. And if we don't do that, I guarantee you, we are already part of somebody else's strategic vision, long-term vision. And unfortunately, the reality is that in the past, and unfortunately moving forward, it looks like major economic blocs still have the same role in their vision for the African continent, for the global South. And that's the traditional colonial role that can be summarized in three major points. And that's what we need to decolonize, what we need to transform. Number one, they see us as the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. That's the role we played during colonial times, and unfortunately, that's the role we still play today. Number two, they see us as the place where industrial output and technology from the global north is sold in our large consumer markets as the consumers of their technology and industrial output. We still play that role today. And most importantly, number three is they see us as the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, technical assistance, job, but effectively what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. Again, that is the colonial role that was imposed on us, and this is the role we play today. So moving forward, if we're serious about a just transition, if we're serious about achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, if we're serious about any progress on any of these major goals, we cannot expect a colonial architecture that was not designed by us, not designed for us, a colonial architecture that is by definition hierarchical, abusive, extractive, and violent. We cannot expect it to deliver a just transition. We cannot expect it to deliver development. Colonialism was not put in place and its design was not for development. So that's why we say we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally decolonized yet. So the important message is that no decarbonization without decolonization. Similarly, you can't expect a colonial architecture to deliver democracy. So we can't democratize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. And of course, for countries that are interested in the idea of de-dollarization, similarly, we can't expect a colonial architecture that is dominated by the US dollar at the top of the hierarchy to be able to de-dollarize unless we simultaneously decolonize these structures. And moving straight into the structural deficiencies that we must decolonize, I want to highlight, some major issues in this that we mention in this report. These are the structural economic deficiencies. Of course, one of the major ones that everybody is paying attention to today is the level of external debt. Africa, as you know, this year alone is paying $74 billion in servicing its debt. That is, more than tripled in the last decade or so. Of course, external debt is important because it removes the fiscal policy space that our countries need to invest in health and education and climate action and all the important priorities. But of course, external debt is actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that I can summarize in three major points. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, low value added manufacturing deficits. And let me explain each very briefly. When I say energy deficits, I include our biggest oil exporter on the continent, that is Nigeria, which imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets up until a few weeks ago when the Dangote refinery was open, and there's a whole fiasco, obviously, about the Dangote refinery. Angola, our second largest exporter, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. And this is not by accident, this is by design, because in the old energy system, the fossil fuel system that we're trying to move away from, we've always been denied access to technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. And similarly, as we move into the new energy system of the future, we're again being denied systematically access to technology to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy infrastructure that we need. And I'll come back to that point later when I talk about renewables. Food deficits. According to UNCTAD, the last report on the food issue, Africa imports 85% of its food, when less than 100 years ago, during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And again, that transition, that deficit is not by accident, it's by design. What kind of design? It's the redesign of the international or the global agricultural food system that as soon as we became independent nations in the mid-50s and early 60s, the global north started to introduce heavy agricultural subsidies in Europe, the US, Canada, Japan, and of course the former Soviet Union to heavily subsidize the production of core crops such as wheat, corn, barley, and so on. And that forced our farmers out of competition. So they had to switch to producing cash crops for exports. So producing more coffee, more tea, more tobacco, and more complementary food items. So today we end up in a situation where we produce what we don't consume, and we consume what we don't produce. And I'll come back to this point because this is the dangerous colonial concept of food security which is a technical term, versus food sovereignty, which was what we want. So I'll come back to this in a few minutes. And then finally, and most importantly, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have in Africa. And I use my words very carefully. The kind of manufacturing base that we're allowed to have is the kind where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with a manufacturing base that exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports. You're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. And when you have these core structural deficiencies, of course, there are more problems, but these are the core ones that we highlight. When you have these structural deficiencies year after year, you end up with a structural trade deficit. And as you know, a structural trade deficit means your currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro and the British pound. And with the weaker currency, anything you need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, you import it at a higher real cost. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our economy. And that immediately puts our governments into a defensive position to protect the most vulnerable. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel to protect the most vulnerable, which makes sense in the short term, but you can't do that for decades. It's unsustainable. And number two, most importantly, we ask our central banks to do their best to defend the exchange rate, to stabilize the exchange rate. And the way they do it with the typical Band-Aid solution is by borrowing more dollars and feeding the external debt vicious cycle. And that is the vicious debt cycle that we have to this day. And once you accumulate unsustainable levels of debt, then your entire economic policy decision-making process is rewired to prioritize any activity that will allow you to earn dollars as quickly as possible to service the debt. And that becomes open season for the extractive industries to come and say, this is your quickest way to those dollars. Don't worry about education. Don't worry about investing in infrastructure. We'll just come and extract and give you dollars. And you stay locked at the bottom of the food chain, essentially. And that is the essence of these structural economic deficiencies. So when we talk about economic transformation, decolonization, these are the structural deficiencies that we must address. And as you'll see in a few minutes, the root causes that we must tackle in order to tackle the external debt problem and our economic deficiencies, all of the solutions on this front will happen to be climate adaptation solutions, so climate action solutions, which is a win-win, coincidentally. So that's the good news in a sense. Here's the picture on an international level, on a global scale. If you divide the world into global north and global south, and you net out all global financial transactions. So you take into account exports, imports, foreign direct investment, remittances from workers, interest payments, even debt relief and climate finance is included, and even illicit financial flows. The net amount is that green line that you're seeing here. And the last data point that we have, which is actually from 2015, is $2 trillion. $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. So that is the neo-colonial net wealth extraction. And again, this number is from 2015, and I'm happy to share with you that a few colleagues of mine and I are working on updating this number up to 2023 data, and we will soon have that number in a report to share with all of you, including the illicit financial flows country by country, which is an important issue that all of us need to pay attention to. But the point that I'm trying to make here, if you pay attention to that green line, notice it's been accelerating over the last 2 or 3 decades, which means if we don't do anything about the global economic architecture that was not designed by us, not designed for us, I guarantee you that number will be more than $2 trillion as we move forward. And there's no mechanism to stop this extraction of wealth other than decolonizing the global economic architecture. And when you think of global economic architecture, you have to think of 4 basic pillars. The first one is the financial architecture, which is what everybody's talking about today, the IMF and the World Bank. And Everybody's talking about reforming the IMF and the World Bank when we should be talking about transforming the World Bank and the IMF. Number two and three in the global economic architecture is the architecture of international trade and investment rules, and that is primarily the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and that's a big blind spot in these conversations about reforming the international architecture. And then finally, of course, the international taxation architecture, which up until a few months ago was in the hands of the OECD countries. And thanks to the Africa Group, thanks to the work of the G77, hand in hand with the Africa Group, we managed to finally take the rules of international taxation from the hands of the OECD countries and into the UN tax framework convention, which is a process that is ongoing, and that's the process of decolonizing international taxation. So without addressing all of these pillars simultaneously, we'll continue to see this neocolonial net wealth extraction from the global south. And now, if you want to summarize this in the context of climate finance, just to look at where we are in terms of climate finance, as we head towards COP29 next month, in November in Baku, this is the summary of where we are. You have $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. So that's money moving in the wrong direction. Next to it, you have the $100 billion that was promised in Copenhagen and not delivered. And whatever was delivered from it was majority non-concessional loans designed for economic entrapment. And then next to it, you have the Green Climate Fund, which the last time I checked had barely $12 billion for the entire global south, with countries having to go through an incredible amount of vetting, sometimes up to 3 years, just to qualify to apply for a small drop in the ocean, essentially, in terms of their needs. And then finally, of course, that tiny little dot you see on the left-hand side of your screen, that's the loss and damage fund that was created last year at COP. And as we speak, it has about $700 million in it. So this is the reality of climate finance today, which means we are not serious about a just transition when it comes to the financial flows. And of course, I always ask people to name a single climate fund that can match the annual profits of these 4 big extractors, fossil fuel extractors on the African continent. And this is the screenshot you want to take and send to your favorite climate negotiator before they go to COP this year, because this means we're not even close to where we need to be. And now let me show you what I mean by economic deficiencies when we look at, this is the African continent as a block. This is Africa's exports. Notice the volume. It's $692 billion worth of exports. Notice you can eyeball the problem right there. We're exporting raw materials, essentially, cash crops, and low value-added manufacturing. Now look at Africa's imports. Notice the number, it's $791 billion, which means we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. And when you zoom in on the categories of our imports, it's core crops like wheat, like rice, like corn, pharmaceutical products, high-tech products, and refined petrochemicals, not the raw materials. So these are the structural deficiencies on display. I'm zooming in on Kenya, but I could have picked any country in the global south, any country in Africa. The picture is very similar. So I'm illustrating today with Kenya's data. Notice the categories of Kenya's exports. It's tea, it's cut flowers, it's coffee, it's complementary food items. And of course, it's refined petrochemicals, low value added manufacturing and raw materials. Notice the volume, it's $12 billion worth of exports. Now look at Kenya's imports, it's $25 billion. So that's the structural trade deficit. And you can, again, see the categories of imports. It's rice, it's wheat, it's corn, it's refined petrochemicals, it's high value added manufacturing and pharmaceutical products. And now that creates this constant pressure on the Kenyan shilling relative to the dollar. So that line going up, that's the US dollar becoming more and more expensive relative to the Kenyan shilling. Look at the data. This goes back to the mid 1990s. So this is not the COVID crisis or the Ukraine crisis or a particular president or prime minister or parliament. Of course, those things matter, but we're talking about some systemic issues here that go beyond any particular crisis. And the same is true for any other country. If I show you the data for any other country, it goes beyond a particular prime minister or a particular president or a particular crisis such as COVID or the global financial crisis or the Ukraine crisis and so on. And the flip side of this is the exponential increase in external debt that we see in Kenya, we see in Ghana, we see across the global South. And that is the process of decolonization that we want to address, is to go to the root causes of this external debt. So now, on to the structural solutions that we propose. If you remember the structural deficiencies, then the solutions will make perfect sense. And here we emphasize the importance of Pan-African cooperation for strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology. And I emphasize not food security. And let me explain very briefly why we reject the concept of food security. Of course, food security in the colloquial sense of the term is a benign term. Of course, nobody objects to food security in the colloquial sense of the term, but here we're underlining a technical term that is used in negotiations, that are used in international agreements. Food security literally means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself, or by buying it from abroad, or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is what we do, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers because they can't compete with free food. And that's why we call for food sovereignty and agroecology, which again happens to address one of the major root causes of external debt. But of course, food sovereignty and agroecology, this is climate adaptation policy. So it's a win-win on the debt and decolonization front, but it's also a win on the climate action front. Number two, renewable energy sovereignty, not renewable energy for exports. And here we mean tapping into Africa's biggest potential, which is not in the fossil fuel sector. The last report from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, about the African continent, and I'm summarizing the key finding here, is saying the following: by 2040, which is the day after tomorrow on the calendar, essentially, by 2040, with existing renewables technology, not with new innovations, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs, 1,000 times, and completely replace all of the continent's fossil fuel exports. So that is within reach. That is the reality. Unfortunately, this is matched by the fact that the continent attracts less than 2% of financial investments that go towards renewables. And that is not by accident. It's by design. We're denied access to the financing to unleash this potential, and we're denied access to technology to unleash this potential, especially that we have all the critical minerals needed to manufacture the infrastructure that we're talking about. So most of the renewables investments that is coming to the continent is still extractive, is to produce green electricity or green hydrogen to export to Europe, or to manufacture green products that go back into the European market without paying the CBAM tax, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism tax, which I'll come back to in a minute. So why is Africa and the Global South denied this potential? I'll give you a simple explanation. If you take the power of the OPEC countries, the economic weight, their geopolitical weight, their weight in the international energy system, take that and multiply it by 1,000. That's Africa's potential. And that potential for massive renewables deployment and economic transformation is unfortunately perceived not as an opportunity, but is perceived by others outside the continent as a threat, as a risk to be managed, as a risk to be eliminated. And that is my explanation, and I'm happy to engage further with that. And then finally, the third key structural solution is strategic investments in Pan-African industrial policies, high value-added industrial policies not high-tech assembly line manufacturing. And why Pan-Africanism matters here. Not, I don't use the term Pan-Africanism as a nice fluffy term we say to each other in nice meetings. I mean it as an economic and geopolitical imperative, because industrialization, real industrial policies, require economies of scale, and our economies individually cannot achieve that. But as regional blocks and as a continental bloc, we have not only the complementarity of resources and capabilities, but we also have the economies of scale. We're the size of China, except much, much richer in potential. And we have the youngest labor force on the planet. What is lacking is access to the manufacturing technology, which I'll come back to. And what are the industrial policies that we want, that we must prioritize at three major industries? Number one, renewables infrastructure, because this is our biggest potential to manufacture and deploy renewables infrastructure, not for export, but to deliver to the 650 million people on this continent who have no access to electricity as we speak. Clean cooking infrastructure to be manufactured and deployed to the 950 million people today, mostly women and children, who are inhaling toxic fumes because of lack of access to clean cooking technology. And green public transportation to link our cities, to link our economies, again, manufactured and deployed on the continent. So instead of industrial policies being assembly line manufacturing to produce products for other people to consume, we're prioritizing the building blocks of development and prosperity on the continent. So these are the key issues. And of course, none of this is possible under a global economic architecture that's still colonial and extractive. So it's structural transformation, not reform, of the global financial architecture, trade and investment architecture, and taxation architecture that I mentioned earlier. And when it comes to, financing all of this, this is how the mainstream climate finance picture works today. From our perspective, from an African perspective, a global South perspective, there's something that everybody agreed to, which is the carbon budget. Some countries, the global North, have exceeded their carbon budget, and therefore they owe a climate debt. And the concept of debt is very simple in finance. Everybody understands this. If I owe you $100, I pay you $100. But mainstream climate finance looks at it this way. Instead of owing you $100 and paying you $100, this is how it works in the current climate finance conversations. I'm going to give you $3 and tell you exactly what to do with those $3. You have to deliver the reports and KPIs and force you into more economic entrapment with the $3 that I give you. And then, of course, I feel bad and I want to give you more for climate finance. So I'm going to lend you $7 at concessional rate, noblesse oblige. And again, and tell you exactly what to do with those $7, more economic entrapment. And then I give you another $10, but you have to give me your forest. You have to give me your forest for pollution permits, for carbon markets, for carbon credits. And then I invest $8 in your economy, but you have to de-risk my investment and you have to produce green hydrogen for me, not for you, right? This is how climate finance today works. And then I invest another $12, but you have to become my CBAM partner. In other words, you have to set up a green industrial zone, borrow money to build the infrastructure, borrow money from me to build the infrastructure, and then lock you at the bottom of the value chain to manufacture consumer products for my economy that I can ship back to the EU market without paying the CBAM tax. So now these are green products produced with green electricity in Africa, produced with low-cost labor in Africa, but consumed at low cost in Europe. And after all of this climate finance, all of these tools, you look at me and say, but wait a minute, where's my $100? I thought that this is a debt, right? And this is what we need to expose, these so-called market-based economic entrapment mechanisms that are not consistent with what climate finance should be, right? From our perspective, climate finance says no reparations for climate damage, no grants. Market-based greenwash solutions is the only thing you hear at COP these days. Concessional loans for more economic entrapment, de-risking for foreign investors to greenwash the extractivism, pollution permits, as I mentioned earlier, which is these carbon credits that are designed essentially to allow the historic polluters in the global north to continue their emissions, not actually reduce their emissions, but offset their pollution with the forest in Kenya, for example. And that forest in Kenya is now designated as carbon market territory, which means it needs to be protected. Protected from whom? From its own custodians, the native communities that have protected the forest for hundreds of years. They have to be displaced because now it's carbon credit territory. And in the meantime, the middleman is collecting commissions and fees, typically middlemen not from the African continent. And the country, like in this case, Kenya, receives financial crumbs that are immediately used, almost immediately used to service the debt. So as the polluters continue their emissions, of course, climate change intensifies, and part of the effects of climate change is forest fires. So when that forest goes up in flames and releases all the carbon that was underground, how have we addressed climate change? So this is unfortunately what we call dangerous distractions and false solutions that are presented to us as the only climate finance options. And of course, you have the so-called green industrialization that is designed to produce cheap green electricity on the African continent in order to assemble low-cost products that will then become green with low-cost labor and low-cost energy to be shipped back to the European market and continue the green energy extractivism and what we call decarbonization by dispossession, as opposed to real industrialization, which is what we want on the African continent. And that's, again, what we want to expose in these climate finance discussions. The framing that we want is climate debt and climate reparations, because that's what the science says, that's what the evidence says. And the global north has exceeded its carbon budget. It has appropriated the atmospheric commons, so it owes a debt to the global south, including the African continent, of course. And one of the latest studies that many of you have probably seen by Fanning and Hickel estimates that the climate debt is $193 trillion. Nowhere near, of course, the $700 million that we see today, for example, in the Loss and Damage Fund, or the $12 billion in the Green Climate Fund. And here's a summary of that study in one picture. Essentially, you have the countries that are marked in green that haven't exceeded their carbon budget. It's essentially the entire global south. Notice that China and India are also there because we're talking about cumulative emissions, not recent years emissions. And the rest of the global north is clearly up on the right-hand side of this screen, the majority of the global south. And now here are the numbers, the summary of who owes what to whom. So even if we exclude India from these climate reparations, even if we exclude China from being recipient of climate reparations, sub-Saharan Africa alone is owed $45 trillion, right? Nowhere near what is being put on the table in terms of climate finance. And this is climate debt to be paid not in the form of loans and economic entrapment and de-risking and carbon markets. We're talking about debt paid as in direct payment. And this is the campaign that some of you have seen, that Climate Action Network International, Power Shift Africa, APMDD, and so many of our allies in the climate movement and the social justice movement have launched this campaign calling for a $5 trillion per year as a good faith down payment towards climate reparations as a starting point. So when we go to COP in November, the minimum that we should be fighting for is $5 trillion per year to start taking real action towards climate adaptation in the global south. And the framing is the following: debt cancellation, not restructuring, not rescheduling. Number two, grants, not loans, and more economic entrapment. And number three, and most importantly, transfer of life-saving technology to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with renewables infrastructure, green public transportation, clean cooking infrastructure, and beyond. And that should be the starting point of the negotiations. And that what we're hoping for is not only for civil society to be united behind this type of demands, but to pressure and push the major blocks in the UNFCCC process, starting with the Africa group, with the G77 as the large umbrella group, with the LDC group, with the AOSIS group, and beyond, in order to push for a complete resetting of the conversation about climate finance and about climate action. And of course, as you can see, I wanted to show you here what I was talking about earlier, which is Africa having the largest renewable energy potential on the planet. And the good news is that it's also matched by the fact that we in Africa and the rest of the global South are home to all the major global reserves of strategic minerals that are needed for the 21st century economy, for the clean tech revolution, for the renewable energy infrastructure that we need. So we have all the resources. We have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. We have the economies of scale. We have the youngest labor force on the planet. What is lacking is transfer of technology. And here, this becomes the big question. Who's going to transfer technology to unleash this potential? We can go to COP and ask for transfer of technology. And I can tell you from off-the-record conversations from research that the global North is not interested in transferring technology, because transferring technology to Africa, to the global South, to unleash this potential means a major disruption of the global geopolitical hierarchy. And remember the colonial hierarchy where Africa and the global South is locked at the bottom. That will be disrupted. And that is a threat to the unipolar world that we have today. So transfer of technology is not going to come from the global North. And this is where, before I go to my conclusion, I want to put this on the table for us to discuss, which is what I've called in some other presentations and some of my work, the bargain of the century. Imagine for a second a united bloc of African countries, or even beyond, global South countries. It doesn't have to be the entire G77. Say 20, 30 countries with the actual complementarity of resources and capabilities, designing their own industrial policy, real industrial policy, to manufacture and deploy the building blocks that I mentioned earlier. We have the resources, the capabilities, economies of scale. We can pre-negotiate the distribution of the value chain. We can pre-negotiate the terms of extraction. We can pre-negotiate everything related to human rights and labor rights and extractivism as our own internal homework. This is the economy of the future. Then we go look for an actual partner to transfer technology, as in joint venture transfer of technology. Imagine that block going to China, which has the entire value chain of, say, manufacturing solar panels. We go to China with the bargain of the century and say, look, in 10 to 15 years, you can double your economic and industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you can double your geopolitical weight globally, and you secure access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, we help address one of the major internal crises that China is seeing, is about to experience now, which is the fact that its high-tech exports, especially EVs, are now finding it extremely difficult to enter American, European, and global North markets because of the trade barriers that are being put against it. And China has this, excess production capacity and excess human capabilities in terms of engineering capabilities that it's becoming more difficult to release in the global economy. We in the global South have a much larger consumer market than the US, Europe, Australia, and Japan combined. The problem is we don't have purchasing power to import those EVs. But if we have real industrialization, real economic development and transformation, we become the bigger market. So I guarantee you that bargain will be accepted by China. In return, here's what China gives that bloc of global South countries. We enter into an agreement to replicate the entire value chain of manufacturing solar panels at scale in that economic bloc. So no need for borrowing money. We have the resources internally. We need access to the manufacturing technology. And of course, it comes with transfer of skills and capacity building and so on, investment in education and technical skills. Now, just triggering that process will immediately give us the bargaining chip to go to the OECD countries and say, look, we give you the same bargain. If you transfer technology to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology on our terms in the global south, we give you the opportunity to partner with us to manufacture and deploy high-speed rail technology, pharmaceutical technology, whatever building blocks we want in our economies. And if they say, no, we don't do that, then we say, okay, we'll go back to China. They have the same wind turbine technology. They have the high-speed rail technology, the pharmaceutical technology. And of course, the idea of this geopolitical bargain is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order as the arbiters of this new multipolar world in which we are no longer at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that's the process of decolonization that we're talking about in terms of specific sectors, specific issues, and it's addressing simultaneously the climate issues, the energy issues, the debt issues, the development issues, and the geopolitical hierarchy issues. So this is what we try to lay out in the report. And here I'm updating you, of course, with some of the work that we've been doing as a team with a lot of our partners across the global south since the publication of the report last year. So to conclude, the time to act is now. The polycrisis that we're dealing with calls for urgent, bold, and radical action. And I use the term radical in the literal sense of the term, but you can take it in the political sense too. Radical means going to the roots of the problem, the structures, right? And if I'm not going to the roots of the problem, I'm operating at the surface level. And surface level intervention is called superficial intervention, no transformation. It produces the status quo and it keeps the same hierarchy. And if you pay attention to all the major global multilateral negotiations, you'll be able to see that the global north is systematically presenting policy solutions that are designed not to disrupt the global hierarchy. And here I'm going to use the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement when he said, and he was a radical, he said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions. And this is precisely what we see in climate negotiations and debt negotiations and the so-called reform of the financial architecture, tranquilizing drugs that are designed to not disrupt the existing hierarchies. And that is not acceptable from an African perspective, from a global South perspective. These so-called mainstream economic policies are too weak, too slow, too expensive. They don't even work, which makes them dangerous economically, socially, politically, and of course, ecologically. And I truly believe that a realistic structural transformation plan and decolonization cannot happen without the restructuring and the transformation of the global economic architecture that I mentioned earlier. And I finally truly believe that a transformative, Pan-African, global South, just transition framework is not only morally necessary, is not only that it's scientifically sound, ecologically mandatory, it's politically feasible, legally desirable, economically unavoidable, and financially affordable. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Fadhel. That was very incisive and a very devastating and picture of a deteriorating scenario. But you offer some solutions and some strategic suggestions at the end of it all. Some of the comments that I see in the chat group, so please, people, questions and comments are now welcome. One one obviously is about the lack of justice in the hierarchy and in the setup, and how we address the question of the justice in the just transition. The other one I see here is about the complicity of African leaders in the entrapment cycle. And maybe you can just reflect on the question of what what activists, what civil society, CSOs should be doing more of, or or what they should be doing less of. That matter. And then for me, also, I just like it also in the context of what the report reveals. Who should be talking to? What are the strategic conversations that 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 we want to see more of? And I mean that in that sense of that of the kind of pan-Africanism that you were describing as well, and then also in the geopolitical.
Well,
So
thank you.
that's my comment
Yeah,
now.
I'll start addressing some of these questions one by one, and if I skip anything, feel free to bring me back to it. But I wanna start with our leaders because we wrote this report and addressed it to African leaders. And when I mentioned this geopolitical bargain forming a united bloc of African global South countries, um, to be honest, a lot of people said, "Oh, this is going to be the African Union." And my answer is always no, it cannot be the African Union, at least not today, not on the, ideally, yes, of course, we want the African Union, but it's just not the right venue at this point, politically speaking, for that type of strategic thinking, and that is the sad reality. So the leaders that we're looking for are key individuals who already have the political courage to think differently and to act differently. That's the starting point. Because if you're not willing to think and act differently, if you're very happy with the red carpets that are presented to you at the G7 meeting or at the G20 meeting or other international venues, then you're really not you're not going to be interested in this vision. So that's the starting point. So going to key countries who are willing to think differently, and even then, it's still like moving mountains to get ministers of industry to think about industrial policy in a new way. Because for them, an industrial policy for a long time was just setting up, the infrastructure so that FDI can come in, so that foreign direct investment can come in and create a few thousand jobs in your economy. In some cases, industrial policy is about building a national industry. And that means when you don't have the economies of scale and you don't have the industrial base, you end up with a so-called industrial policy that is actually manufacturing a small piece in somebody else's industrial policy. So that's not real industrial policies. So getting ministers of industry to think beyond their national borders and getting clearance from their prime ministers and presidents to start thinking about the regional industrial policies is a major obstacle. And of course, I'm not mentioning any of the other, institutional obstacles, but just decolonizing the mind of ministers of industries, of people who work in this, of economists actually, who work in this sector is difficult enough. And then thinking through what types of priorities industrial policies. We still see countries and ministers of industries thinking of prioritizing industries that will export some item in order for the country to earn dollars to service the debt, which is understandable to some extent, but that's not how you get out of the trap, right? Very few are thinking about manufacturing the building blocks that they actually need in the country or in the region. So these are some serious conversations that we need to tackle. And of course, we do have institutions that have the convening power and the financial power to convene these conversations at the highest level. Where's the African Development Bank with its financial power and its convening power to convene these conversations? It's not there. It's still thinking about green industrial policies that are designed by the EU or that are designed by the US to keep us locked at the bottom of the value chain. And that is a sad reality, a sad recognition. So this is what we need to fight, right? Before we fight the corruption and all of that stuff. Of course, those are important, but decolonizing the mind so we can have a basis for these conversation is important. So what we've been doing with this report is mobilizing and organizing and educating and empowering civil society and think tanks and academics across the continent to think differently about structural issues and to move away from the siloed approach. And I think we've made some progress in the last year. But now, simultaneously, we're working sort of the push from below with civil society, but also the push from above with some key policymakers across the global south, including the African continent. Now, there's some serious obstacles because nobody can do this alone. So you have to wait until you have a critical mass of countries and leaders who actually understand the need for this regional cooperation. Then the real work begins, the real coordination begins. And of course, you have to anticipate that, blocks in the global north that I mentioned earlier will not stand by and wait for you to actually decolonize, that there will be resistance inside and outside. And that bloc needs to be ready for this disruption and resistance, because this is real disruption of geopolitical hierarchies, economic hierarchies that were designed during colonial times not to be disrupted. So we have to be cognizant of the monumental task that we have ahead of us. And this is really the unfinished business of decolonizing the continent. We've decolonized our borders and we have our flags and our militaries and our national anthems and everything, but we didn't finish the real work of decolonizing our economies. Our economies are still steered from abroad. And that decolonization, just like decolonizing and the fight for independence in the 50s and 60s and beyond was resisted with violence, this structural decolonization will be also resisted, maybe even with violence. So we have to be prepared for all of this. I hope I answered some of your questions, but there are other questions in the chat. I wasn't able to go through all of them. Please feel free to jump in and put them on the table for me. Thank you.
And there's a nice one from Siraj Mohammed. Are you optimistic about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
The short answer, under the current setting, no, absolutely not. Here's why. Because if we don't do any of the structural transformation that we talk about in the report, on the agriculture front, on the industrialization front, on the energy front, then what does free trade across the continent do? It will continue to accelerate the existing engines of extractivism in the sense that we'll be able to import more and circulate internally. What are we going to export to each other? Bananas and coffee and tobacco? No. But if we have real agricultural and food sovereignty strategy, then some of our countries within the region, within the continent, will export wheat and corn and rice to each other, right? If we have real complementarity of industrial policies to manufacture and deploy renewables, then yes, the free trade agreement across the continent will help us interlink our economies with infrastructure that we build, but also to link our industries. But if we're all consumers of imported stuff from abroad, and then you set up a free trade area, then we'll export and import from each other stuff that is manufactured and produced abroad, and we collectively stay locked at the bottom of the value chain. So that potential can only be unleashed after we undergo this structural transformation.
There's a comment here that in terms of export, the institutionalization of export-led growth approaches, African civil society has been captured in a sense by Europe and the EU. I don't know what your reflections are on that. Are there pockets of hope? Are there examples of where this is not happening? What can you reflect on any good examples where there is progress
in terms of undoing some of the export-oriented? Unfortunately not, because in many cases, whether investments are coming or financing is coming from multilateral development banks, including African Development Bank or Afrexim Bank, or it's coming from private investors, you have the financing dictating what is the world of possibilities. And when the financing is coming from outside, it's expecting a rate of return in US dollars. So if you're investing in food sovereignty to produce corn or wheat or rice for your internal market, you're selling it in the local currency and you're generating revenues in the local currency, not in US dollars. So that's not something that a foreign investor will support because that's too risky. Your food sovereignty and producing for your own people is a risk to them because it doesn't generate dollars. But if the investor wants dollars in return, then you're going to rewire your priorities and grow more coffee and tobacco and tea and strawberries and bananas for exports, because then the investor is confident that the bananas will be sold internationally with USD returns that they can, collect. So we're trapped into this food security model, and it's being financed by multilateral development banks, by African Development Bank, by our own governments. Our governments prioritize ministries of agriculture, have no agricultural policies. They're implementing essentially complementary policies to the European Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, right? So that's why I keep saying we need to rethink. This is the process of decolonizing ministries of agriculture, decolonizing ministries of industry, so we can reset the priorities. But if we continue on the same path, export-oriented growth, which is dictated by multilateral development banks and external financing, will continue with the model of economic entrapment. Here's the thing about, say, the World Bank and IMF. These are institutions that have literally dictated with their conditionalities economic policies in our countries for decades, right? Micromanaging our decision-making and influencing national priorities. The fact that we're in a debt trap today means one of two things. It either means that these institutions are completely incompetent and should be rejected, or that they're engaged in intentional economic entrapment. And I truly believe it's the latter. Either way, their model of economic development must be rejected and replaced with real structural transformation, economic decolonization. And that's, in a sense, what we tried to present in this report.
Okay, thank you. There are two hands raised in amongst participants. First is Tasneem Eso, and the second is Patrick Musibi. I'm going to ask Tasneem to first unmute and make a comment or ask a question.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thanks, Fadhel, and hello to everybody. I want to pick up on the question that was, I think, misunderstood a little bit in the chat, and that is the question about the role of civil society and the proposition that, in fact, civil society has been captured by these very, vested interests, the EU, etc., in terms of funding. And two points I'd like to make. One, the important response to what you have spelled out to us now, Fadhel, letting us understand, exposing these traps and the tactics used around it. And then secondly, the solutions you present, which is a Pan-African Global South united response. I think that part of that Pan-African united response is not only about at the level of governments and decision makers and, industrial sectors, but it has to be a Pan-African Global South, civil society, movements, and unity behind this agenda. And I think that at least in some of the spaces we work in, the climate space in Africa, there are exciting new initiatives that's building a wider African movement of movements, the kinds of campaign work that we're doing, calling out the fossil fuel industry and the examples, Don't Gas Africa, etc., as well as the renewable energy work, the clean cooking work, etc. Again, though, like you said, we tend to work in our little bubbles. The climate movement does the climate movement things. The energy people do the energy things. Trade does their thing. Tax justice people do their things. And we have been trying to pull together a much more cross-movement coalitions so that we can, in fact, deal with the more fundamental, get to the roots, the radical We want to be radical, but also get to these more fundamental system transformation issues. So I just wanted to respond, Bruce, to that very directed question about civil society itself being captured. And yes, of course, we are also part of that system, and we are also trapped in our need for funding, etc. But we don't have to be. Yes, we can get funding, but we don't have to back down on what we're fighting for. So I thought, Bruce, I'd respond to that particular question that was raised twice in the chat. Thanks.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Fadhel. Could I just for the purposes of expediency, ask Patrick to make his comment, and then you respond to those two, and then there's a third question as well. Okay, so Patrick, could you unmute?
Thank you very much. Professor Fadhel, this has been a very, very enlightening presentation. Interestingly, I encountered you on a short TikTok clip that somebody shared on our WhatsApp group today. So I decided to research you and managed to come across the short film that you did on Kenya. That resonated so much with me. And then I've continued to read here and there. The thing is, yes, we have touched on it. We need this transformation. Most of it at the policy level, where we expect our leadership to play a very big role. Now, one of our problems on the continent is that some of our leadership are complicit in this entrapment that we find ourselves in. My question is, what role does the average citizen have to play in this transformation? Currently I'm working with UNICEF, but I'm coming to the end of my service with the UN. I'm turning 65 on the 5th of October next month. The area where I'm really passionate about is working with military veterans. I am a military veteran. I retired from the military over 3 decades ago, but we work very closely together. And I found that this kind of transformation could be a new rallying call for military veterans across the continent to play a role in this. So my question is, what can we do? Over to you, Prof. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. Over to you.
Should we take Sarah's question and respond at once?
Yeah. Sorry. Whose question?
Sarah's.
Sarah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. My name is Sarah Sadoun. I work with Human Rights Watch. And I wanted to ask about this, particularly building on the comment about the need for kind of coming out of silos and creating more kind of comprehensive frameworks that bring a lot of these issues together. So there's this concept emerging around the human rights economy being championed in particular by the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And I fully appreciate the kind of suspicion around using human rights language, particularly because human rights conditionalities on economic agreements is often used in a way to kind of further reinforce this kind of colonial hierarchies. But part of the, in some ways that cut the sort of the power of flipping the script in a sense with the human rights economy and, kind of confronting countries that purport to be champions of human rights with the reality that actually they have a human rights obligation to reform their laws and international infrastructure in order to enable the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, which includes economic cooperation and assistance, meaning that all the things that you were describing around debt, trade, tax, the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, actually there is a human rights obligation to reform these institutions and laws in order to kind of create the kind of changes that you described. And I'm wondering if you've thought about this concept and if you find it helpful at all. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with Sarah's question and go back to Patrick and Tasneem. Absolutely. I mean, the first messages I put on the slides about we can't decarbonize, we can't democratize, we can't de-dollarize a system that's structurally still colonized. And some of my other presentations, when it comes to human rights, I say the same thing. We can't really have achieve human rights goals, gender equity goals in a system that is structurally colonial and extractive and abusive. Because if we all agree that the colonial structures that I described in the beginning, the fact that we're locked at the bottom of the value chain, we're still playing the role of the cheap raw materials continent for the global north, and we're still the consumers of industrial output and technology. That same colonial role, we play it today. And if we all agree that colonialism and colonial structures were not designed for development or for human rights or for equity or for a just transition, then we must agree that none of those goals can be achieved without decolonizing those structures. So if we're serious about human rights, if we're serious about just transition, if we're serious about the SDGs, then we must transform and undo the colonial role that was imposed on the African continent. And that should be the beginning of the conversation. And then who's going to foot the bill for that transformation is going back to the historic responsibility, right? On the climate front, on the colonial front, on the economic entrapment front. And then we start using a filter or a lens to assess every economic policy proposal. Every policy proposal that is put on the table as so-called reform must be assessed based on, does it actually undo those colonial roles? Does it actually produce real transformation? If it does, then that's real transformation. If it doesn't, then it must be one of those tranquilizing drugs that is designed to reproduce the status quo. And so that's the starting point. And to your point, Sarah, I'm giving a similar presentation, a much shorter version of this next month in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council specifically on this question on development and decolonization as it relates to human rights. Patrick, your question is very relevant, and I get this all the time. What can the average person or the average civil society organization do to help move the agenda in this direction? And I always say you start by inform, mobilize, organize, strategize for this transformation, and everybody has a role in this. What we described earlier as decolonizing the mind starts with us internally, and this is not necessarily because we're trying to shoot ourselves in the foot, but we've been so conditioned to using false solutions that get us deeper into these traps. I'll give you one example. Tourism, for example, is often viewed as, a great, policy tool for economic development. What's not to like? You bring millions of tourists, they bring dollars, they create jobs in hotels and transportation and entertainment industry. And it's good. Lots of jobs are created, lots of money's coming to the country. But we forget that when a country doesn't have food sovereignty, doesn't have energy sovereignty, you bring 10 million tourists, you have to feed them. So we import food that we don't have. And that gets you deeper into that structural trap. And of course, you import food that is, for tourism, it's the higher end foods, of course. When you bring 10 million tourists, you have to transport them. You have to heat and cool the hotels for them. You have to import, entertainment equipment and infrastructure, all of which is imported and drives us deeper into that structural trap, right? And of course, all of our countries are competing for the same tourists, racing to the bottom to lower the cost. And many of our countries, of course, subsidize the food that the tourists eat, and we subsidize the fuel that the tourism industry uses. We're not saying we should end tourism, but as part of our tourism strategy, if we have food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, then yes, tourism can be a net benefit. But under the current circumstances, tourism is part of the structural traps. But of course, Today, if we have no solution, of course, the tourists that you bring, even though it's driving you deeper in the trap, they're creating jobs. So we continue with the same pattern. And of course, we want tourism to be sustainable and ecological and cultural and all of that. But where is the rethinking of the systemic approach in the ministries of tourism, in the ministries of agriculture, and the ministries of energy? It's not happening yet. So not to blame people in the tourism industry, but this is the reality. We've been conditioned to accept that this is our best way out of poverty is tourism. And I can go through the list of so many other activities that we do, and we cover this in the report. These are part of the structural traps that we're in. We need to undo these traps. And of course, everything we're talking about is about long-term transformation. And this is the other question we get all the time. Yes, this is long-term and this is great, but where do we start today? And I always say the long-term starts today. The long-term started yesterday. So every step we take in the right direction starts to undo the damage. I'll give you a very simple example. Every metric ton of wheat or rice or corn we produce this year, and 1 metric ton is very easy to produce. You know, we dedicate some land and some resources. It doesn't require external financing. Every metric ton of food we produce locally saves us the equivalent of dollars we have to borrow and interest we have to pay for the next decade. So 1 metric ton starts to get us out of the trap. And the good thing about agriculture, an agricultural season is very quick. So the results, the impact is immediate. Same thing on the renewable energy front. Every green kilowatt hour we produce locally saves us the equivalent in dollars we had to borrow to import fuel and interest we have to pay sometimes for decades. And that's good news on the debt front. That's good news in terms of job creation. That's good news in terms of decolonization and structural transformation. And all of these are good news in terms of climate adaptation. So these are realistic, concrete steps we can start taking today. Tomorrow morning, we can start taking these steps. The question is, do we have the political leadership that is cognizant enough and thoughtful enough to think about these transformational policies or not? And the reality is our leaders are sitting under so much pressure, thinking about, you know, when they think about economic priorities. I'm from Tunisia. My country is in a debt crisis and a food crisis for the last several years. When our leaders are thinking about priorities, they're thinking, can we pay for the food that's waiting at the port? And companies are refusing to unload wheat before we pay them in cash, right? Can we pay the salaries at the end of the month? Yes, these are burning kind of fires that we have to deal with immediately, but we must carve out the time and space to think about long-term transformation. And that is completely possible. This is within reach. And that's what we're trying to advocate here. The good news, and I'm coming here to Tasneem's comment, which was very, very important, is that we've done some good work in the last few years, bringing in African civil society organizations under one coherent umbrella, and Global South, broader Global South civil society as a united front with the $5 trillion campaign. Tasneem mentioned the Africa Movement Building Space, which is an unbranded, sort of under the radar civil society strategizing group of dozens and dozens of civil society organizations coordinating. Don't Gas Africa, Kick Total out of Africa. All of these campaigns are coming out of across multiple silos, civil society organizations uniting under one vision. And what we try to do under this type of work is to make sure that our colleagues who are working on the food sovereignty front recognize that their struggle is linked directly to the debt and development and human rights struggles of other organizations. And simultaneously, the colleagues who are working on tax justice, their fight is the same fight as the food sovereignty fight, as the debt fight, as the renewable energy fight, as the decolonization fight. So we've done good work on this front. And now our more challenging work is to convince policymakers who operate under a completely different set of constraints. They may be able to understand the interlinkages, but when it comes to practical steps that they can take forward, it takes political courage, it takes creativity, and it takes, the capacity to kind of mute a little bit of the noise of the short-term pressure and think beyond election cycles and think beyond next month or the next 3 months. And that is the struggle, because, you know, take a country like Kenya. Kenya uses 50% of its export revenues every year to pay interest on the debt. Right. So when we talk about the fiscal policy space as being completely destroyed by debt, it means we need to start looking at the structural issues of the debt. But instead, when you're under so much pressure domestically and internationally, and you have so many vulnerabilities, you tend to prioritize what is achievable. So you end up going for the crumbs in the system as opposed to the real transformation. So the more pressure and unity we build from below on the civil society front, on the think tank front, and the media front also, media plays a key role in this, the more pressure and support we give to leaders so that they take the correct path and move away from the so-called tranquilizing drugs and the crumbs in the financial system. So all of this is happening. There's a lot more to be done, not just on the African continent, but across the global South, because the issues are similar across many regions in the global South.
Okay, thank you. We're moving, getting close to 7:30, and I don't want to move much beyond 7:30 with respect to people's commitment. There's a specific one from Nazima. I'll just run two here that I think, you know, maybe, yeah, because one is, what role is there for African universities in skills development for these envisaged industrial changes that will undo the entrapment cycle, dependency cycle? Are universities thinking about skills development required for a just transition? There's another one up there which I picked up on, but I don't. I mean, you know, it's just because I'm always fascinated when China comes up. So this is from Tom Atianasio. I don't understand why China would transfer manufacturing technology to Africa on a large scale. Maybe you can just comment on those two, and before we go.
Sure. Yeah, very good question. So on the question on education and technical skills and the role of universities, absolutely. I'm an academic, so I believe in education, and when you think of the skills that are needed for an industrial transformation of the kind we're describing, and here China is a relevant example. China has consistently produced and still produces 1.5 million engineers per year for the last 3 decades at least. And at least 200,000 of those engineers every year are MIT level engineers. And they're not produced in random, without a design, without a purpose. The skills are produced to feed into industrial policies, specific technical skills, research and development capabilities that are targeted for specific long-term transformation. So even Europe and the US don't even match the level of production of skills that China has done and continues to do. So our responsibility in Africa and the global South, and our university responsibilities is to do that. And we do quite a bit of this, but we also experience brain drain, because when you produce the skills and there's no outlet for them for gainful employment, for actual application of their skills, then the natural result is brain drain. So all of that ecosystem needs to be thought out very carefully. The question about why would China transfer technology in this? Well, several reasons. Number one, Chinese foreign policy at the highest level has already expressed interest in partnering with the global South, transferring technology, even financing development. But China has always made it very clear that we'll never tell you what to do and we'll never interfere your internal affairs, which means it's our responsibility to design our joint industrial policy and then go to China and say, this is how we want to partner, right? Unfortunately, many of our leaders in the global South are used to leaders from the global North coming to us and telling us, here's what we want you to do with the money that we give you. And by the way, no transfer of technology. And the conditions are imposed for economic entrapment. So we're not even used to, engaging with real partners. We're used to engaging in neo-colonial abuse. And that needs to stop. We have to be very honest about this. Number two, China has, as I mentioned earlier, has a serious internal stability problem, economic stability problem, which is it is no longer at the bottom of the global value chain. It's still an export-oriented economy. Yes, it does have a large internal market, but it's relying on exports, and its future is still relying on exports because of the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's relying on its biggest consumers in the global north to consume its high-end products, such as EVs. And those markets are closing their doors to Chinese products. And that's a serious internal problem. Who's going to consume the growth in EV production if it's not the EU, if it's not the US, if it's not Australia and Japan? And we're saying we can be the consumers, but only if we have the purchasing power. If we have the purchasing power, we'll be able to consume, and we're a much bigger market, right? But in order to have the purchasing power, we need to industrialize and truly develop and have the purchasing power for that. Number two, the other reason why China will transfer technologies because it is being pushed back down in the global hierarchy by the US, by Europe. So its opportunity to increase its economic and geopolitical weight is to partner with the global South, the biggest market on the planet, the biggest market that also has all the resources and complementarity of resources and capabilities to create a multipolar world, right? In terms of economic and geopolitical distribution. And so that is our potential, that's our opportunity, but it's not going to happen by China coming and telling us this is how we do it. It is our responsibility, if we truly want to escape the bottom of the hierarchy, to design our own industrial policy, our own vision to reposition Africa away from the bottom of the hierarchy. And we have a willing partner, but a willing partner is not going to do your homework for you. It's not going to do the work for you. We have to do that.
Okay, I'm going to. It's a 1930 SAST. I'm going to call it an evening there, and thank you profusely, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, for this very lucid, thought-provoking talk on the challenges and the possibilities for the just transition, climate and energy transformation. And also giving us a very clear framework within which to place our to think about the goals and the objectives. This is a very important subject and talk that we've had, and I'm without delay going to make it available on our YouTube channel and spread the link. I will also, that link is also, you can access it from the Institute for African Alternatives website, which is Ifaa, the Institute for African Alternatives. You can access it off that website, but you'll also be on our YouTube channel. This did not, unfortunately, live stream on that channel, but we will publish it there and spread the good work. And yeah, once again, thank you very much, and thank you for the lively conversation. Thanks for all those who at such short notice came and shared with us and participated. We had 40 participants, and we're very happy with that, especially at short notice. Thank you, Dr. Kaboub.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Professor Kaboub, I look forward to meeting you in Nairobi when you're back.
Sounds good. I'll see you soon, Patrick. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof. Well done.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.